Greetings, viewer. If you watched my feature-length ramble on Sniper Ghost Warrior 3, first of all, thank you, and second, you'll remember that it was a massive blow to CI Games' staff and their already terrible reputation. An ambitious AAA project that suffered a disastrous dev cycle and numerous delays, only to be tossed out into the pile of reasons why nobody ever takes them seriously. You'd think that would have been the end for our Polish pals, but against all odds, it still managed to sell 1 million copies across all platforms in less than a year, leading to 24 million euros in profits. One downside later, they were able to stay afloat, much to the chagrin of basically everyone but me. A similar mentality was then applied to the series itself. After CI CEO straight up admitted that SGW3 was a big mistake, which is more honesty and ownership than I would expect from an executive, and I'd praise it more if you didn't Google yourself to sniff out criticism, you prick. Taking the DNA of the third game's core gameplay, you know, the good parts, they decided to distill it into a series of smaller but still sprawling sandboxes, scattered with a selection of objectives or contracts, hence the new name, Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts. Because we sure needed a fourth word tacked onto an already embarrassing name and make it sound even more mobile-y. At least now I can just say contracts instead of the mouthful of syllables that is SGW. This time around, it seems like they're taking after Hitman, but instead of discreet social stealth, you shoot everyone's head off. As far as I can tell, the development was comparatively quite smooth, being announced in August 2018 and dropping in November 2019 without a single delay, seeing as how most of the work was already done. To top it all off, it also sold for a modest AA price with an added 10% discount on Steam right at launch. Miraculously, the lessons that CI have learned over time finally seem to have mostly paid off, scoring a decent 71 on Metacritic, a first for this series, and a comfortable user score of 74% on Steam. So proud of them. Of course, these improvements failed to impress detractors who clearly shit on contracts for dumb, random reasons seemingly without actually playing it. German users certainly did not approve of the censored gore in their copies, and generally a lot of misinformation about this game gets tossed around. Otherwise, even a simply decent score is a gigantic leap forward for CI's portfolio. Naturally, since I like to SGW3 despite its many shortcomings and have dropped multiple hints about what I think about contracts, I guess my feelings toward it are mostly a foregone conclusion. After the weird attempt at an emotional conspiracy theory thing that SGW3 tried, Contracts' premise returns to the uncomplicated days of the past titles, with one small yet big change. Instead of burly American military schlock, it's burly, ambiguous nationality, but still probably American mercenary schlock. I don't know about you, but this slight framing change instantly eases a lot of the cringe factor for me. I guess it's just the lack of America poisoning. Anyway, you play as an assassin known only by the codename Seeker, who's been hired by a mysterious organization. Handled by the Handler, you're sent to Siberia, which is now an independent country after a war with Russia, to dismantle Prime Minister Nergui Kurchatov's corrupt regime. That's all they wrote, really. There is mention of a presumably friendly rebel faction called the Siberian Wolves, but at best they're a red herring, and at worst, forgettable set dressing. No crazy twists in the plot this time around, just a good old kinda generic Carmackian story. And yes, because Siberia is canonically a new country, you're killing Siberians, not Russians, so all those butthurt comments can shut the fuck up. Now, once again using CryEngine 4, if SGW3 was a high amplitude sine wave, Contracts is the line that travels straight through the middle of it. It never quite reaches the gorgeous peaks of its predecessor, but doesn't ever fall into the pits of pure ugly. Right away, you might notice that the lighting and color palette, easily the highlights of the last game, are now a lot flatter and generally feels a bit less photorealistic and interesting, at least to me. Because the day-night cycle is gone, the lighting's less dynamic. As for the colors, they're still pretty nice, but way less creative. I'd say that only the third map feels like they tried to go for a more interesting vibe with its saturated blues, yellows, and greens, but it still doesn't hold a candle to SGW3. And generally speaking, for a 2019 game, it does lag behind its contemporaries. Another slight downgrade I've noticed is that many of the returning weapons have smoother looking and less detailed textures. What once looked like a rugged, real steel firearm now almost looks like a toy. But regardless, it's overall alright looking in a vacuum, and it's not all downgrades. For instance, the lack of a day-night cycle means that the levels can maintain a consistent level of quality, so you don't have many moments where the lighting sucks. The overall image looks and feels sharper, and I think the contrast is better too. And perhaps the biggest improvement is that things in the distance aren't nearly as washed out and actually look clear and readable, which is good for both the graphics and gameplay. Performance is hit or miss. In some levels, things are more or less buttery smooth, and at worst, it can feel very jittery, and I sometimes get brief freezes when loading areas or sometimes when killing enemies. A lot of these easily come across in video, so sorry about any potential stutters. However, a little while after I recorded the first run of footage for this game, I upgraded my CPU and RAM, and now it runs noticeably better in general, although some areas still struggle a bit. Your mileage will very likely vary, however. I know a fellow contracts enjoyer who allegedly had a CPU that was about on the same level as my last one, and an AMD GPU that on paper runs circles around my 1060, yet they ultimately had awful performance. On the flip side, there's another based individual who has a straight up weaker rig but had no complaints to speak of. Another thing that's been downgraded is the music, despite having the same composer. It still sorta sets the mood, but it's way more bland and boring than its use of traditional Siberian instruments and electronic music would imply. So sadly, that hauntingly beautiful atmosphere SGW3 had is sorta gone. The only combat track and main menu theme don't fare much better either. Speaking of which, here's a warning. If you're watching this in a dark room, on a big screen, or both, do whatever you can to darken the screen or otherwise prepare your eyes, because I'm gonna need to complain about the menus and perhaps use more footage of it down the line. So, assuming you're ready, 3, 2, 1, fucking hell! I get that it's supposed to be like snow or whatever, but come on, this is basically Discord's cursed light mode. Provided you can still see, can I quickly gush over the game's aesthetics? Likely taking the aggressively tactical spoiler enemies of the last game and their mild sci-fi vibes a bit further, it seems like CI are finally trying to go for a look that isn't just milquetoast modern military stuff. While everything around Seeker is still standard current day stuff, everything associated with him is firmly in Black Ops 2 with a hint of Deus Ex, creating a crisis-like dynamic of you being a high-tech predator versus an army of hapless, dated mooks, except it's in a game that doesn't bore me to tears. Let's talk about Seeker's mad drip. First of all, there was clearly less of an attempt at being realistic, so long gone are ghillie suits and other boring generic military getups, and say hello to a casual yet badass looking coat, a brooding hood, a nano suit that justifies the health regen.
Your suit is made from extremely durable, intelligent microfibers that also support your body's natural regeneration abilities. What's more, your mask syncs with your central nervous system, heavily enhancing your reflexes and coordination.
Meaning?
You will be fine.
And to top it off, that signature minimalist geometric mask with the single glowing red eye of edginess.
Hey!
Is that a Squid Game reference?
And yes, even though the game is in first person, you still get the unique looking gloves courtesy of the nanosuit. They have absolutely nailed the tactical present +1 mercenary vibe from head to toe, and Seeker is my husband. The slight sci-fi vibe seems to have gone into the briefing cutscenes as well, which also looks super cool, and much like the mission design, wear the Hitman influence on their sleeves. Lastly, the futuristic elements can also be found in the game's version of Scout Mode, now called Mask Mode, the new drone model, the reticles, and some bits of the sound design, like the detection noise, the weapon wheel, and the almost AI-like filter they use for Handler's voice.
Seeker, we have new intel. We have learnt that Kurchatov ordered the secret police to bug his brother-in-law.
Where's the trust these days?
Oh, and on that subject, I just want to say I really love Handler's voice actor, Lawrence Dobies? Sorry. He has a posh, prim, and proper British accent that fits the tone of the game really well, and is leagues ahead of SGW3's Frank and Lydia.
You unbelievable fucking asshole.
I don't know about you, but personally, this identity shift away from pure generic military stuff does wonders to breathe new life into the franchise, and cuts away the cloying patriotism. And again, it's just fucking rad. Now to things you actually care about. Because Contrax's gameplay is almost copied directly from 3, I'll focus more on any differences I managed to find. The sniping is... it's almost perfect. It's just a little bit too easy now thanks to the dynamic reticle system. Two things I am actually fine with are the numbers that mark your drop distance, which in my opinion just removes the need for testing beforehand, and this neat measuring graph in the top left quadrant which works with a shocking degree of accuracy. The way it works is that you line up a standing target with the silhouette. Here, the target's head lines up to about 2/5 of the way between 200 and 300 meters, or 260 meters. So I adjust my aim by that much and manage to score a direct hit. It's a really cool way to compensate for a lack of a built-in rangefinder. Or, you know, just take them. I also like how its existence is justified by Seeker's mask. But going down to the more questionable changes, instead of using a wind gauge, there's lines that extend out to exactly how far your shot will deviate at a certain distance. Even if SGW3's gauge also told you exactly how much you needed to aim, its placement in the UI still added the slightest bit of uncertainty. I guess it's technically not that bad, but what really destroys what's otherwise a nice UI that more or less balances readability and vagueness is this dumb bullet drop line that you can't disable, not in the options, nor on the highest difficulty. If I need to play devil's advocate, it won't tell you exactly where your shot will end up, but rather a range of possibilities, but real talk, it's almost as patronizing as the red dot of dumbassery that, thankfully, has been omitted entirely. Which reminds me, forgive me for this rant, but I need to get this off my chest. I hate to be rude and arrogant, but I'm gonna. If I had $1 for every idiot who whined that they still somehow can't aim in this game despite all the hand-holding hints brought by the DRS, I'd be able to buy all the DLC for Contracts too. I gotta ask, what is your fucking problem? You're just matching numbers and following a very clear visual representation of the trajectory. The tutorial guides you step by fucking step with additional on-screen instructions! Hell, I'll even teach you right now! Step 1. Tag an enemy to see how far away they are. This is also known as their distance, which is the number that appears over their head after you tag them. The number shows how far away they are. Step 2. Adjust your elevation if you need to, and make sure it's as close to the distance value as possible. This lets you compensate for bullet drop because they're affected by gravity. Be sure to use the bullet trajectory line, which shows your bullet's trajectory if you need to. Step 3. Then you need to compensate for the wind, which pushes your shots left or right, which, in case you weren't sure, this is left, this is right. You need to line up your target with the correct line that shows how much the shot is being pushed, in case you forgot, which is the one that more or less matches the distance value, which is shown after you tag an enemy,
and lets you know how far away they are.
Step 4. Now apply pressure to the left mouse button. Again, this is left,
And this is right, to squeeze the trigger, which is part of the gun that fires a bullet, to fire a bullet. This will send the bullet to where you're aiming, which will kill an enemy on contact. You'll know you're aiming properly when the enemy's there, which means that
You should hopefully get the idea by now. The game does everything in its power to help you aim your shots outside of actually having the red dot of redundancy. And not only are these cretins not able to do something as simple as reading numbers, they have the audacity to blame the game for their own shortcomings. It's like an army of little DSPs, and it annoys me way more than it should. If you want to see a game with actually batshit ballistics, play Sniper Elite, where you'll need to spend a half hour learning the ins and outs of each individual rifle, some of which feel like Nerf guns, and maybe get a physics degree. If you're new to contracts, do not listen to any of these liars. Gee, that was simmering inside of me for nearly 2 years. Let's step away from the Steam forums before the rest of my hair falls out. The sniping, thankfully, still feels good enough and serves its purpose as a balancing factor to make them less boring compared to other games. The margin of error is technically there, but the bullet drop line robs you of most of the satisfaction that comes from doing all the mental math. While we're talking about aiming, the scopes now take up the whole screen rather than letting you see the actual scope model like the last two games. I saw it as a visual downgrade at first with the removal of seeing your fingers as you twist the dials, and how the reticle is clearly a static image superimposed over a 3D scope model. Eventually though, I warmed to it since the lack of these Rockstar type animations means you can adjust your zoom in elevation much faster than before. As for the arsenal, Contracts makes some attempts to fix SGW3's balance issues. It's still not entirely successful in some aspects, and when I played all the levels for the first time when recording footage, I just bought my favorite rifle and barely felt the need to switch. However, I did have more of a desire to change rifles when getting additional footage, mostly for aesthetics. So I guess that's better? Rather than letting you attach any scope and use any respective special ammo with any rifle, which made it really easy to become complacent with light semi-auto snipers in SGW3, in Contracts, scope power generally correlates with stopping power, so most of the rifles chambered in 7.62 may only reach a maximum of 10 times, while a 50 cal and one of the 3.38s can go up to 24. So I suppose in theory, the weaker rifles could be geared towards a slightly more aggressive, medium range playstyle. And side note, the scope upgrades are really weird. There's 3 tiers going from the weakest, default scope, to a scope with the highest available zoom with more granular adjustments. The strange thing is that you can skip directly to the 3rd scope with no hassle. There's no need to buy the 2nd tier scope beforehand, so it's a total waste of money. As for the special ammo, the same lineup returns without any new additions, and my opinions of them mostly remain the same. The only real differences are that EMP rounds are no longer limited to 50 cals, which makes more sense and makes them way better since you can use them discreetly. Taking rounds might have a bit more use due to some changes to how Recon works, and you need upgrades to equip them in the first place. Also, explosive rounds are even more of a joke now since you can shoot enemy grenades which have a bigger blast radius than the former. Each rifle is limited to a set of 3 different types, with the only exception being the B95 Chris, which can use all of them. The sets seem kinda arbitrary for the most part. For example, none of the 3.38 rifles can equip luring rounds except for the Source T50 for no reason other than creating the niche of being the only 3.38 rifle with luring. I also find it annoying that there's no way to tell in-game what special ammo is even available for a particular rifle without buying it and its special mag. Which brings me to the new magazine upgrades. Aside from extended mags, you've also got fast mags which increase your reload and swap speed and in some cases doubles as an extended mag for some reason, and the aforementioned special mags which unlocks a special ammo slot at the expense of your mag capacity, with a few odd exceptions where it doesn't change. This also stacks with the skill, allowing you to carry 2 types or use one kind with the other mag options. In addition to suppressors, you also have 2 basically useless loud barrel extensions if you don't care about practicality, either a muzzle brake or a flash hider. The muzzle brake supposedly decreases recoil, but according to my tests, I can neither see nor feel any improvements with it on or off. Even if it worked properly, the rifle shoots slow enough that it's not an issue to begin with. Flash hiders, as far as my tests are concerned, are essentially less effective suppressors, only decreasing your noise radius by about 15 meters. Their description also says they reduce your rifle's visible signature, but just use a suppressor if you want to be quiet. Bipods also make a return once again, but they can only be applied to the 338 and 50 cal rifles. They work like before, but used to suffer from an odd bug. When you toggled it on, set it up, and then unmounted by moving or whatever, it got folded up automatically, but the weapon wheel would still say it's on, so you had to turn it off to enable it again, which was really weird. This doesn't happen anymore thanks to a recent patch, but I'm mentioning this just in case I happen to use footage of that bug later on. Overall, Contrax's arsenal does sort of feel more diverse than before, even if some of the variety seems to have been born from dice rolls rather than making more deliberate, interesting niches. However, at the end of the day, there will still be rifles that reign supreme, and this time, that award goes to the 338 rifles. If you recall, they were honestly kinda shitty in SGW3, providing a negligible and even inconsistent damage advantage over the 7.62 rifles. Here, they're by far the most versatile ones on offer, with high zoom scopes and easy body shot kills or even limb kills if you're lazy, while still being able to be suppressed. You can even one-shot a heavy to the head without the help of AP, if you want to use the meta, except no substitute. Of these, my personal pick is the Reese ESR 2020, partially for aesthetics because I really like the MSR, and also because it has very low sway. Because of the aforementioned buffs, 50 cals now fill even less of a niche. While these iterations are actually even more perplexingly quiet compared to SGW3, only audible up to either 100 or 115 meters, they no longer provide the significant damage increase compared to 338. At best, these will allow you to one-shot a heavy to the torso and maybe make limb kills more consistent, but it's not worth giving up your versatility. While you could make a case for them in 3, in Contrax, I wouldn't bother when much quieter rifles with similar power exist. That being said, if I had to pick one, the Model Ron B82 is by far the better option, with its semi-auto nature and decent mag size allowing for very fast follow-up shots if nothing else. The bolt-action B95 Chris, on the other hand, is basically just a slower Ron, with the only attempt at making it more enticing is, like I said, its compatibility with every special ammo type in the game, all of which are already spread out across all the medium rifles if you include the SV AMUR. It's also slightly louder than the Ron by about 15 meters. While it may not seem like much, you'd be surprised at how much of a difference it can make with some vantage points. It's just not practical. Once again, there's a large variety of camos. No obnoxious John North approved America themed ones here, but there's certainly enough to give anyone with supposedly good taste an aneurysm. And because I'm not sure where to put this, I'll get better at writing one day, bolt actions have an odd property where if you fire, then scope out before Seeker racks the bolt, a significantly slower animation plays, hurting your already slow rate of fire. I assume this is here just to prevent quick scoping or something. Let's talk about the bullet cams. For the first time in this series, they aren't bad pizza. Generally, this is some gourmet shit right here. This time, the cinematography when the bullet is in flight can range from pretty standard and serviceable to wildly dynamic as the camera spins and orbits around your shot, and it's a real joy to watch. We also get those neat close-ups of the player again after their absence from the last game, and they are better than ever. There's a decent amount of variety, with shots over the shoulder, close-ups of the face, or full body shots. On top of that, they animated Seeker's trigger finger, and if you're using a semi-auto rifle, you can even see the friggin' casing eject! I'm really not exaggerating my enthusiasm here. This shit is as smooth and slick as the brains of people who can't aim in this game. However, things do fall apart slightly on impact. Seeing as how the death animations often did more bad than good in the last game, instead of fixing them, they just went with ragdolls like days of old. It does look a lot cheaper and even downright goofy, but it has a lower chance of fucking up. The sounds could have more oomph too. Everything feels too subtle and low-key for such energetic bullet cams, from the gunshot to the impact. Going back to the praise, gore returns, but with a lot of improvements. If you recall from the last game, you'd only be able to destroy a head if you triggered a bullet cam with either a 50 or AP round. Now, assuming you're shooting at a normal mook and not any other special character model, you can explode heads regardless if one plays, and more weapons are now capable of doing so, from light snipers to shotguns to even some pistols. I'd complain it happens a little too often if it wasn't so much fun. Even better, you can now blow off limbs as well with either explosives or a well-placed shot. Admittedly, it's pretty basic since all you get is 1 point of amputation per limb, and if you really want to get pedantic, they don't stay in the environment. But what is this, the Trepang 2 suggestion channel? Finally, they've also added a slider to fine-tune the frequency of the cams, so you can either make them trigger after almost every kill, or only every now and then. Overall, the series' bullet cams finally now have something to offer over Sniper Elite. The former provides wicked cinematography and proper jibbing, and the latter is for people who aren't completely over the novelty of blowing up testicles. As for sneaking around, Contracts almost feels the same as last time, but the key difference is that the AI feels significantly less forgiving. The best demonstration of this is how they deal with dead bodies. In SGW3, if an enemy sees one, they'll slowly approach it and will alert the others when they get close enough, so you'll have ample time to save your run. Standard stuff. Now, it's a bit of a crapshoot. Sometimes you'll have a bit of time like before, but most other times you'll basically have no chance to kill them before the entire base gets suspicious. It's not like they'll know exactly where you are right away, but it'll make enemies far more perceptive as well as scatter patrols in positions which can mess up plans. I wouldn't call it bullshit difficult, it's still more fair than the first game, but it'll take some getting used to. I still frequently make mistakes even after more than 100 hours logged, although this is me we're talking about. There is at least one forgiving change. Enemies will only get a little suspicious if you miss a shot. However, any more will alert them. You can use this to pause the mook's pathing to make it easier to aim your follow-up shot. Also, I'd be remiss to not mention one extremely odd bug that, out of the dozens of hours I've played, I've only encountered recently while recording footage. I've had enemies be alerted to the corpse of a mook killed from a takedown that I had already moved.
I found a flash drive.
Your mask has read it. It contains medical records for all laboratory staff. On Antanasia's file, it states that she is a smoker. I've marked the...
While this didn't ruin the games as I managed to play it for so long without even realizing it was even a thing, it was frankly unacceptable. I was gonna go on a rant of tough love, but again, the recent patch seemed to have fixed it since I couldn't reproduce it, so that's good. Additionally, enemies can and will try to spot you with binoculars if alerted now, which will obviously increase their vision range. Admittedly, this crucial information is straight up never taught to you, so I almost don't blame people for thinking it's a bug. But the fact of the matter is, if you see a guy looking through binoculars about to detect you, but then you kill him, you'll see the detection meter vanish accordingly. It's not a bug, it's a new behavior that you need to deal with, either through good observation, timing, or relocation. More things added to the stealth to increase threat are drones and spotlights. Usually, if a base goes on alert, drones will emerge from these boxes to hunt you down. As far as I can tell, they're basically just flying cameras that make relocation a bit harder. The spotlights behave exactly as you'd expect. Stay in the shadow, avoid the light. They're essentially cameras that aren't always a threat. If they don't move, they're just normal lights. Like enemy binoculars though, the game never tells you they're a threat until it's too late, which really confused me the first time I ever played this. You can't even tag them. Your only clue is that their detection meter has a special mortar missile icon to differentiate them, although they don't seem to trigger any mortar strikes. One thing that has seen a massive upgrade are how the takedowns feel. Remember when I said they had potential in SGW3? Some of the animations make a reappearance here, and the really bad ones are tossed away entirely. And besides a few auto missions, they've been spruced up with super dramatic sound effects and/or slow-mo, which gives the previously floaty but otherwise well choreographed and surprisingly varied animations some much needed impact. They feel better than ever now, and to me, never get old.
These tangos are... He found it. We got company?
Do not go. That is what they want. Terrorists.
They could have stopped there and called it a day, but CIA had the good grace to add a few new animations, and they all look good for the most part.
I like it cut, G.
This also includes some new, viciously brutal takedowns against heavies, and a way more satisfying lethal interrogation animation that replaces the awkward chokehold from the last game. The latter even has significantly better voice acting, mostly for the enemies.
The other soldiers' locations, now!
I'll tell you. There.
Start talking.
They're stationed here.
I'd say that the only bad thing about the takedowns is that, like the bullet camps in SGW2, which is still a bad game, and Enemy Front, they disable the motion blur. SGW3 was fine, so what happened here? For that reason, I had to just leave it off permanently so that it can't taunt me, even if it does look really nice. Finally, while we're on the subject of interrogations, something that's really cool is that all the targets and bounties have unique interrogation dialogue. Sometimes it's just edgy, you're gonna die now stuff.
What? Who are?
Famine.
You mean those prisoners? We were starving. We were all starving.
It's a cruel world. Tabakov has been eliminated.
But some targets allude to something much greater happening behind the scenes.
Who are you?
You don't get to ask questions.
Wait, that's the mask.
Finish him, Seeker.
It ends now, Doctor.
You're working for him. I see.
What are you talking about?
Just a little irony of fate.
We're running out of time, Seeker.
Show me your face.
Why? You won't have time to remember it.
You have no idea who's pulling your strings, do you?
Do you?
Let's talk, Seeker. Do your job.
None of this is ever really elaborated on, unfortunately, but I do appreciate the effort to add little details that more or less reward curious players for going out of their way. Much like the last game, I don't really think it matters what silent pistol you pack, since most of them fulfill the close-range head-popping role just fine. My personal favorite might be the Rottweil M23, simply because it happens to look the best with the sight and shoots the fastest. The Gus M9 is also quite nice as well. For some reason the game considers it a heavy pistol, which means you can actually get collaterals with it. And yes, it can blow up heads, which is hilarious. Some notable changes to the sidearm category include every pistol having their own unique red dot sight, fast mags alongside extended mags, the ability to ruin them with gaudy camos, and 2 more loud-oriented pistols to accompany the Spring 686 revolver. The Falcon, I see what you did there, and the Gaston, I also see what you did there. Not gonna lie, I'm actually very impressed with the first two. For the 2 high-caliber pistols, they deal an obscene amount of damage, being able to one-shot all basic mooks to the torso, get double kills, and with a well-placed shot, can even one-shot a heavy to the fucking noggin! Compared to the frustratingly inconsistent revolver of the last game, this alone makes them worth trying out for a laugh. As for the differences, the Spring feels a little more consistent, but obviously only has 6 shots and reloads pretty slowly, and the tactical reloads seem to be bugged since the gun isn't considered loaded until like a second after the animation is done, while the Falcon is better in both of those aspects and can be improved upon further. No one spews bullets like Gaston. Being a full auto pistol, it can just about compete with other automatic weapons in terms of damage output, however, it suffers from a massive drawback. You spawn by default with a paltry 40 rounds, just under 3 magazines worth, and you better believe you'll chew through that faster than Yahtzee quit playing this game because he sucked at it. Because of this, the Gaston is utterly devoid of practical utility aside from massive giggle factor. Even though these 3 can't be suppressed, something incredibly strange that I have to mention is that they are still stupidly quiet. Like, they'll only be heard out to 20 meters before the sound just disappears. I really don't like this, even if it works to my advantage. Not only does it give stupid realism simps more ammo to disparage this game because they don't know how to provide criticism with actual substance, balance-wise, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I wouldn't bring it with me in a building, but if you're in a somewhat open area with enemies placed just far enough from each other, you could easily get away with one-shotting everything to the chest with a high-caliber pistol or spraying people down with the Gaston. The more careful approach you need to use with a weaker suppressed pistol goes out the window. And I hate to use an immersion argument, but like, it's immersion breaking. It's not an acceptable break from reality that adds to the gameplay in a meaningful way, like the sniping ballistics. It just feels like a lapse in judgment at best and a balancing problem at worst. Even if they fell into the why bother giving up your quiet pistol when you have an assault rifle purgatory, it would have seemed like less of a blunder. The secondary gunplay generally feels like it did in 3. Once again, it's clearly not the main attraction here, and it does just enough to feel adequate. Some positive changes include the more consistent gore, so head and limb shots can have serious impact, and your guns no longer stay in a rested position after sprinting, which alleviates some of the clunk. There's also nothing wrong with them damage-wise. On the flip side, enemies seem to be able to mow you down much faster than before, and you can only carry a maximum of an arbitrary 55 rounds of assault rifle ammo in reserve, plus whatever you have in your magazine, cramming them into the role of emergency weapons that can't be used for very long unless you try to loot bodies during combat. Making things worse for assault rifles, they can no longer accept suppressors, and the ridiculous drum mags have been replaced by either a fast mag that hurts your already small ammo pool, or a basic extended mag. Granted, it's pretty obvious why they did this, so it's not like I'm really disappointed. At least you can ruin them with camos now. They're all more or less as effective as one another, but if I had to pick a favorite, I'd choose either the AMA A7 for its low recoil, or the MK-A12 for its pleasing iron sights. Also, the LMG is still in this game, but it's only available as a temporary weapon that must be obtained from heavies. Not that you'd want to keep it anyway, since the horrendous SGW-1 level recoil makes it incredibly unpleasant to use. As for the shotguns, the ammo's been tweaked a fair bit from the last game, for the better. Buckshot's range and damage has been reined in a bit, while slugs have seen a pretty massive glow up compared to 3, actually allowing for relatively reliable one-shot kills up to at least a few dozen meters. They still have moments where they act a touch inconsistent, but otherwise, I actually like them now. On top of that, since you're able to carry both and spawn with 28 of each, you won't need to restock them as often. Their performance depends a fair bit on which of the two shotguns you use. The returning Giovanni M4 is best used with buckshot since its semi-auto nature allows you to double tap or just mag dump a barrage of pellets up close, making up for the nerfs. Slugs are also perfectly usable, but I felt like my aim still drifts a bit with this thing when under fire, so that lets it down a fair bit. As for the Kel-T, which was added in an update, with the somewhat slow pump, sluggish sprint out time, superior stability, and integrated red dot, it seems like it was built from the ground up to be a mini sniper rifle with slugs. While it still can perform decently with buckshot up close, the slower handling characteristics makes the ammo shortcomings more apparent. They also both now have access to a muzzle brake and a choke. Frankly, the accuracy and range buff from the latter is way more useful than reduced recoil. The Giovanni is best used up close anyway, and the Kel-T is too slow for it to even be a factor. Now back to things I need to talk about for self-fulfillment, even though I know you don't care. Sorta like the graphics, Contrax's sound design is a little more consistent than SGW3's, but they're still kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes the guns end up sounding better, and sometimes they're worse. I still kinda like them, but of course no one else does. Starting with the snipers, most of the unsilenced shots have a nice pleasing crack to them, but they lack bass and don't really slap your eardrums like a gong anymore. As for the 50 cals, the tail of their shots do have a nice thunder-like rumble, but the initial part of the shot, which ought to be super loud, is severely lacking. Interestingly, the Source T50, despite being a 338, uses the same tail sound, but the actual shot has a loud, almost metallic clang to it, so it ends up sounding way better. When suppressed, they honestly sound a bit more interesting. They're technically not super amazing, but some of them still have a satisfyingly sufficient amount of punch for what they are, and they feel a bit less samey compared to the last game's mouse farts. However, there are still some that sound legitimately awful, like the Reese, because of course my favorite rifle has to. Unsilenced pistols are a mixed bag. Some sound great and surpass their previous iterations, while some are significantly worse. When suppressed, there's more variety than before, but they could still sound boneless or straight up bad. The secondaries unanimously sound better across the board, with the assault rifles and LMG having a very pleasing chatter to them which contributes to the nicer gun feel. And the Giovanni doesn't sound like a sneeze anymore. Have you noticed that the echo sound is the same for every weapon yet? And also, I'm really fond of the sound of grenade explosions. As for the animations, even though we've seen a ton of improvements and additions in other areas, they've largely been lifted wholesale from the last game, which means that we still have snipers that are perpetually held in a relaxed stance and reload mostly off screen. Most of the pistols have the same reload and slow slides, and the secondaries are only just about serviceable. The most bewildering thing is that the DLC weapons that were released at launch, the SV AMUR and the Sturm Bodyguard 9, both have unique animation sets that avoids all those problems. What gives? Recon isn't necessarily harder per se, but it's certainly a more measured affair, at least when you start. In SGW3, all you needed to do was send in your drones, skim a base, and you'll take everyone with ease, even enemies that you didn't even know were there. As for contracts, you don't even have the drone unlocked by default. Instead, you're given a pair of binoculars that are built into Seeker's Mask. First of all, instead of being able to get a bird's eye view from virtually anywhere, you'll need to position yourself on a vantage point first. And then, in order to properly tag an enemy, you need to stare directly at their head for like half a second to complete it. There's a weird inconsistency with what the game considers as a visible head. You can't take an enemy through a catwalk with holes in it, but thick trees aren't a problem. The drone itself has also been nerfed into the ground as a recon device. Not only does it take time to take enemies, its battery life and range are severely reduced, and the presence of drone jamming towers give you way less room to fly with no way to mitigate it. To be fair though, it does seem that enemies are positioned in such a way where you can take the vast majority of them with your binoculars from an obvious vantage point, so in the end, I'm not that bothered by it. Really, that applies to my overall opinion of these recon tweaks. It does take a lot longer, but it does force you to be more observant and tactical, I guess. It also makes areas that don't have a vantage point far more tense, since you'll basically have to go in blind until you get the auto tag.
Where are the others? Locations now!
They're right there.
On top of that, some areas may have a jammer that will remove tags after a very short period of time, which is something, at least in the past I believe, wasn't really explained to you, so many people were actually led to believe it was a bug, which is kinda hilarious but also sad. Personally, I think it's a really interesting idea that's perhaps a little too easy to tackle. you don't even need EMP rounds, just shoot the power box on the side and it'll be good to go with zero drawbacks. It's a bit of a shame because that would have incentivized using the manual distance measuring system. I think a good solution would be to place them in less exposed areas that may require some finesse to get a good angle on, or force you to use EMPs or some other tool. As for your gadgets, the majority of them are reused from SGW3, with some getting a few tweaks. I have more or less the same thoughts on any returning unaltered gadgets, so I won't waste much time on them. Meds have gotten a few changes. First of all, they now share the same slots as the rest of your gadgets rather than having their own separate wheel and controls. This likely won't make or break things, but it's an interesting change. Since Contracts now uses a normal regenerating health bar rather than the segmented Far Cry style one, adrenaline shots will now double the speed of your health regen, while medkits will heal all of your health at once at the cost of taking a while to use. Frankly, there's very little use for the latter if you play stealthily. There's also another feature that makes adrenaline more fun, if not straight up better, but we'll get to that later. Remember how much I hated the throwing knives in the last game? Well, in Contracts, I am pleased to say that they've gotten a pretty massive buff. They just feel a lot smoother and easier to aim despite not having a crosshair, and when they hit their mark, they can now kill more consistently, and in some cases you may get a ridiculous ragdoll.
You're a poopy head. Can we spell it out? You're a poopy head.
I even now think they have a slight advantage over pistols, if only because the combo of throwing a knife and then taking down an enemy just feels a little bit better. There are still moments where they inexplicably can't kill, but they're nevertheless more trustworthy and have a welcome spot in my arsenal. The drone now takes up a gadget slot, and like I said before, it's not really an amazing recon tool anymore. However, it is still a really handy hacking device, so I still like having it around. But it can be quite buggy. If you reload a checkpoint for any reason, the hacking prompt will refuse to appear, which is super annoying. It can also now send out an EMP pulse, which can be a good plan B if that bug occurs, although it's fairly loud, having a noise radius of about 40 meters or so. The only thing that's 100% new is the sniper turret, which does exactly what you think it does. With your binoculars, you mark enemies by pressing H and then you tap G to fire. It's perfect for sig shots, or I suppose Overwatch, although I never bothered with that myself. It's absurdly powerful, even being able to one-shot heavies, or two if they're alerted. To balance it out, you've only got 16 shots without any way to refill it. It can also be spotted by enemies, so be careful where you place it. I also found that it can still occasionally miss, although what exactly causes this is unclear. As for the upgrades, you can choose between giving it a suppressor, which I highly recommend since without it, it can be heard out to at least 100 meters or so, although my testing was slightly inconsistent at times, or a semi-auto upgrade that's honestly useless because the rate of fire straight up doesn't change. Great job. And later, you could take up to 3 targets. There's also a booby trap upgrade that I never found a use for. Basically, when you press J by default, the turret disappears and Seeker uses telekinesis to instantly ragdollize and jib anyone standing near it. It's too funny to even be annoyed by. If you recall from SGW3, the upgrade system revolved around hopelessly bland, unrewarding, padded out skill shrubs that barely changed the way the game felt. Thankfully, Contracts manages to mostly skirt around these issues. The first thing is that the upgrades will gradually alter the way you approach and play the game. While there's obviously still some things in here that are rather mundane, like increased inventory space, a lot of them give you skills that allow you to improve existing strategies, or even create some new ones. Now, it's not like this is some insane Metroidvania or immersive sim level shit, but it's wholly adequate. Just to go over a few things that are really nice, there's a small tree dedicated to making Seeker harder to detect, which will eventually change the color of his jacket depending on the environment, which is quite cool to see. It may sound like a mundane statistical upgrade, but this really allows you to take more risks during gameplay. The same thing goes with reducing your fall damage. Thermal night vision is now a skill you can unlock rather than being a gadget, so now you can turn it on by holding the mask mode button instead of needing to equip it, then activating it. Well, it lives up to its name. It gives you thermal vision and makes everything look like nighttime. Jokes aside, it's very good for making enemies and their tags stand out, even if the night vision part is a total sham. Things start becoming absurd, interesting, or even OP rather quickly. For instance, you've heard of basic noise reduction, right? Well, how about making literally zero noise when sprinting? Speaking of which, what about getting a 5-second speed boost after a takedown? And why not have Mask Mode automatically tag every enemy within a 40-meter radius? You can even upgrade equipment other than your drone now. You can make decoy traps lethal by making them emit gas when approached, making them only slightly better. Anti-tank mines can be upgraded so that people can set them off, if you don't give a shit about stealth and wanna laugh. And perhaps my favorite, adrenaline shots can give you a speed boost on use. Usually I purposely take fall damage and then heal just to be more efficient when traversing. It also stacks with the melee speed boost to utterly hilarious results, making you move so fast it's actually hard to control.
You couldn't even comprehend how fast I am.
There's even some minor decision making to be had. In the segments where two skills or upgrades share the same spot, you can only choose one or the other, although this sometimes falls flat if one's clearly superior to the other with no trade-offs. Another criticism I have is that some of the game-changing skills are admittedly just things that you could do by default in the last game, like chain kills, seeing certain things in mask mode, and hacking turrets by hand, but at least they still technically change the gameplay and are worth getting, unlike some of the useless shit in 3. With enough of these, contracts will start to play quite a bit differently for better or worse depending on what kind of game you're looking for. When you first start, you generally feel like an average person with average abilities. Even with sufficient map knowledge, it gets pretty tense and you want to be as slow and careful as possible. By the time you get yourself enough upgrades plus better weapons and gadgets, you become this borderline omniscient demigod able to curb stomp a level in no time flat. You could say that the challenge and tension gets completely dissolved and at worst is at odds with the core gameplay, you know, if you're boring. Snark aside, while there's a case to be made here, it'd probably be nice if you could disable skills if you felt like doing a more difficult run. I don't think the stealth power fantasy is a bad thing per se, like Crisis, but actually good. These upgrades play into and promote replaying maps, which is another key part of Contracts' formula by allowing you to approach them differently, and it's not just because of the level design. It also just lets you breeze through them more or less, which can be nice if you want to replay a map without it taking too much of your time. A good example of this is your Mask's auto tag. You'll ultimately spend less time with Recon and repeat playthroughs so you can get to killing faster. As for earning them, instead of grinding skill points from certain actions in a certain tree, and sometimes needing an obscene amount of them to get something that's not even that good, skills now only require a modest amount of money to unlock, and challenge tokens for higher tier ones. Because you can earn a decent chunk of change after completing a mission, you can earn more upgrades at once and get useful skills a lot sooner than before. It actually feels rewarding now. Speaking of which, the economy overall is much better. While I rarely ever thought about the cost of items in the last game, nor did I ever use its useless crafting system, because everything in Contracts primarily requires money, I found myself needing to ration it at least a little bit when preparing for the next level. I asked myself, what skills do I want right now? Do I want to buy a new gun? Should I buy the turret and drone? It's not exactly a hair-pulling decision, but I did enjoy trying to optimize my progression in the first several hours of my playthrough. The fact that everything depends on one currency can also motivate you to complete challenges, kill bounties, and find collectibles. Of course, not doing them won't leave you starving for more money, but if nothing else, they won't feel like a total waste of time, especially the collectibles, which were totally pointless in the last game. You also have 3 different tokens to deal with. Contract tokens earned through main objectives, intel tokens earned from bounties and collectibles, and the aforementioned challenge tokens, take a wild guess, that are used to buy certain rifles, attachments, and skills respectively. I really like this system because contract tokens still lock certain weapons behind story progression, but you can pick and choose whatever you want first, and in the case of intel and challenge tokens, I think it's a reasonable way to incentivize doing the side content. That thankfully doesn't ruin the pacing in the first place. Contracts' enemy lineup has been simplified, yet feels more diverse close due to some minor tweaks and improvements. First of all, the dumb tier system from SGW3 has been removed, which makes sure that a certain enemy type will have the same amount of health no matter what, making your weapons feel far more consistent. It also dodges the issue of certain character models having more health despite looking less armored. All standard mooks are marked with a triangle, which includes grunts, riflemen, and sergeants, or shotgunners as I prefer to call them. Grunts are obviously the most basic enemy type, so I have nothing to say really. Riflemen are a bit more distinct this time around, having noticeably more health, rifles that I think might be more powerful than the ones the grunts use, and perhaps the most interesting addition is, like I mentioned earlier, a tiny frag grenade hanging off their right hip that you can blow up for super satisfying multi-kills and jibbing.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Unfortunately, the exploding effect doesn't look great, it's barely even there. Shotgunners seem to have the same amount of health as riflemen, if not ever so slightly more, but are still immune to gas and also have grenades on their hip. However, it doesn't seem like they toss smoke grenades anymore. Not a big deal, but it was mildly unique and interesting. Officers are marked with a rhombus, and after being virtually pointless in the last game, here they're the only ones who can give you mission critical info when interrogated, or items if you loot them.
I'm looking for Nishlev. Tell me where he is.
He's inspecting the containers. You'll find him there.
Listen carefully. I need information about Dorshev's operations.
Oh, fuck! He keeps documents inside the cage, in the safe. Ugh.
Unfortunately, their usefulness falls off as you learn the maps over time, since objectives usually don't change positions. But nevertheless, it's a good change and is nice for new players. Heavies are marked with a pentagon and have seen a mix of buffs and nerfs. The first thing is their head. While SGW3 saw them having weak spots in the back of their head or even having zero face protection period, they now wear these chonky helmets that are extremely resistant to lower calibers, so in order to one-shot them, you'll need to aim at the tiny gap between their helmet and armor. They're still severely allergic to anything stronger than that, like I said before, although I've had some instances where I just broke the faceplate. But if nothing else, they're actually a real threat when you first start. Seriously, on my replay, I didn't even try to kill any in the first mission. This also means that dealing with them in close range isn't really a safe option, unless you unlock the skill that lets you take them down with melee. Finally, circles refer to enemy snipers. Again, self-explanatory. Aside from spawning with random rifles, either being a 7.62 or even a 50 cal, they're pretty much unchanged. Their spawns, however, can be utterly sadistic. Sometimes they're placed far away from other patrolling enemies. And sure, it's realistic, but in terms of things that actually matter for gameplay, they can border on noob traps if you don't already know where to look.
We want puppies, we want puppies.
Before I dig into the level design, I want to cover some other broad info about them in general. A feature that's emphasized is the ability to exfiltrate mid-mission, which you can do after completing at least one objective. Frankly, I think this is kinda pointless. It doesn't function as a save station because you can leave mid-mission just by quitting through the menu, and you'll retain all of your progress since the last checkpoint, including money earned, nor does it allow you to edit and upgrade your loadout since any changes won't be applied until you start a level from the very beginning. Speaking of saving, yet another thing people love to bitch and moan about is how the game handles saves. Browse the Steam forums and you'll see plenty of Takahashi saying how they keep losing like 30 minutes of progress and how much they want quick saves to compensate for their incompetence. In reality, they just need to get good because I find the checkpoint system to be perfect. Whenever you walk into a different area, eliminate every enemy in an outpost, complete an objective, and hell, sometimes as you're in the middle of doing an objective, the game autosaves frequently. In practice, that means you need to either play well, play through your mistakes, or actually be punished by losing at least a few minutes of progress if you do want to reload. If the game did have quick saves, you fucking know that people would say shit like,
"The game has no challenge because you can save scum."
Hell, I think it's still too forgiving as is. The game will save almost every time you cross into a new area, and all corpses present before an autosave will disappear when you reload a checkpoint. So if you die or get caught and want to restart, you actually have an advantage. Please try not to abuse either of these, especially since reloading saves can actually break a few things if you're unlucky. You've got that hacking bug with the drone, for example. Speaking of which, it seems that turrets that were hacked before an autosave, as opposed to simply being EMP'd, will once again be able to spot you in their down state, which will still set off an alarm. Or, and this one seriously pissed me off when it happened, a jammer you shot will technically be down, but it'll still jam your tags with no way to fix it besides restarting the whole map. These issues don't ruin the game and may apparently not always happen, but it reminds me that contracts might actually be crap and I really don't want it to be. Another thing I recommend you avoid abusing are the fast travel points. Normally this wouldn't be an issue in and of themselves, but for some reason, they can all be used right off the bat unless you have pending contracts to upload to Excel points or are in combat. Obviously, this can allow you to completely bypass certain areas with no penalty, which is the cheesiest of cheese tactics. Avoid using them on a first playthrough at the very least. Why they aren't something you have to unlock by progressing is beyond me. Each level has a set of 6 challenges, each with varying levels of difficulty and money and token rewards. For the most part, they're a nice addition, encouraging repeat playthroughs and are actually worth doing to earn challenge tokens. However, one issue I have with them is that some of the easier ones are uninteresting and arbitrary, while the higher value ones actually do require some level of skill or map knowledge, or are at least compelling enough to try, like complete the mission without raising an alarm, beat the level only using a knife, or beat the level in 25 minutes or less, and so on. The lower tier stuff are menial tasks that usually have little to do with level mastery, if at all, like get 20 headshots, wallbang 5 enemies, or kill 3 enemies with mines. Unlike the former, these aren't really the kind of things that would motivate someone to replay a mission in a meaningfully different way. Another issue is that they can be quite vague. For example, the second mission has a challenge where you need to blow up 10 enemies. The explosive kills that actually count are ones from equipment or barrels. Ones from explosive ammo or even shooting an enemy's grenade, easily the hardest method, bizarrely won't be registered. Each map also has 2 bounty targets that can be killed for more money and intel tokens, although the way it works is that only one can spawn in at a time. If you successfully kill one, you'll have to play the map again to get the second bounty. After they're both dead, they unfortunately never return, with the odd exception of the ones in the third level, where they'll both spawn at the same time after the first 2 successful hits. It's also important to note that it's not as simple as popping them then leaving. You'll need to loot their corpse first, so clearing the area as quietly as possible is a smart idea. The areas they spawn in aren't the most complex, a bit like some of the smaller outposts in the last game, but they tend to be heavily guarded, which ensures that these little areas still stay pretty challenging, some more than others. They all more or less play the same, except for one very interesting case. There's a bounty in this part of the third map where, upon looting the target, a certain Team Alpha will rush in ready to gun you down on sight. There's literally no information on who they are. These aggressively tactical mercs barge into the map, try to kill you, and refuse to elaborate further. I'm only mentioning them because it's just so weird and mysterious. Anyway, on top of that, you're not the only sniper on the scene. A rival marksman or woman, damn boy, he's thick, will be overlooking the vicinity somewhere in the area. They won't hesitate to shoot you on sight, so you better keep your wits about you. Also, they too continue to carry the aggressively tactical vibe. Again, they have this mysterious aura, so it makes me wonder who they even are. Also, I'd be remiss to not mention an instance where my target seemingly just died from a heart attack or something.
The target, Cherenkov, is dead.
I had already killed the rival too, so it's not like they could have done it. The game is good, I swear. As for the level design in general, Contracts more or less feels like SGW3 with the fat trimmed off. You get a similar free-form stealth experience, but with less downtime, meaning infinitely better pacing. You know, less this, more of this. The maps predictably boil down into several large hotspots connected by some paths littered with enemy patrols or small outposts. So, to save some time, unless there's something somewhat noteworthy about them, I won't have very very much to say about what I'll refer to as traversal sections. They serve their purpose in making sure your short commutes aren't as dead as the last game, and there's enough space to make them not feel like corridors. Another thing that's been improved is the overall enemy density. While 3 had many instances of enemy placements being so sparse in larger bases that you usually never had to worry about poorly timed kills, here they're more tightly packed, enemies often patrol in pairs, and sometimes their positions are too exposed, making pulling the trigger a lot more risky. While each level technically allows you to complete your objectives in any order you want, there's something that I'll call the invisible hand that sort of nudges you into playing them in a specific order or way, either because it's more efficient or more advantageous, and its strength varies from level to level. You don't have to obey it, but sometimes the optimized strategies you're led to can reduce replay value since you might not want to bother with other routes that would take significantly more time and effort. On the bright side, that does mean that the game does flow really well between objectives, which means less downtime. How you might like to play the game may vary greatly though, so please don't kill me if I ignore or write off something you like. I'll also be approaching each level using info from at least a couple of playthroughs, partially to try to cover as much ground as I can handle, and also because skills and better equipment allow for different strategies, especially in the first few levels where you don't have much to your name. Oh, and I guess if you don't want the level layouts to be spoiled for you, I guess you could skip this. It's not story content, but I figured that this might be a concern. After a quick 1x2 tutorial, you're first sent to the Altai Mountains to assassinate General Dmitry Ivanovsky, who quite possibly has the most Russian name I've ever heard and might have been a real person, and destroy or steal anything related to his bioweapon project. The first objective I'd like to tackle is downloading Ivanovsky's plans in this little outpost not too far from the spawn point. Overall, this is a pretty good start, and it's at least a little more interesting to play through once you dig a little deeper. While I bet most people will be drawn to the nearby vantage point marked by a handy light and stay there to plink, you can also use the ledges ahead to get different angles to line up cool shots. There's at least 2 triple kill opportunities, one of which involves shooting a grenade, which is unsubtle but irresistibly satisfying. There's also another vantage point closer to the base that allows you to get a clear view of the backside, and from there you can silently kill everyone and then enter the outpost through a side entrance. However, in my first run, I wasn't well equipped enough to annihilate everyone, didn't know about the tactic I just mentioned, and I certainly didn't feel like brute forcing it. So I opted to be as careful as possible, only killing mooks I knew wouldn't be spotted. I then approached the base from the left side by following a ledge and then dropped right in when the coast was clear. It's really nice how the layout and patrols seem to be designed to accommodate this tactic for new playthroughs. Now, if you don't mind me digressing, normally the laptop you need to hack resides in this building. Every time I played this in the past, it has always spawned there for me, and that seems to be the case for most people too. But for some reason, it actually spawned in a different hut this playthrough, so I thought my game was broken for a second. So I guess there is some RNG involved with where it spawns, I just have no idea why I never saw it until now. No other objectives and other missions are like this to my knowledge. Anyway, I still went up to that building to access the CCTV terminal residing there, which hacks the cameras all the way in the large base across the map where Ivanovsky is, allowing me to tag almost every enemy there. Now, this is an example of the invisible hand doing its work. This terminal is simply too advantageous to ignore, so you'll almost always want to do this objective before confronting Ivanovsky, especially since it's so close to where you spawn. From this point, the closest objective is in a nearby forest behind the outpost, where you need to locate an allied spy, or what's left of him. There's multiple ways to get there, the best and quickest path being hidden by thick grass. All you really need to do is search the body, find nothing, and get scolded by Handler.
I cannot find any samples.
I am disappointed, Seeker.
So that took basically no effort to complete, but heading to Ivanovsky's base from here is a different story. Without any of the upgrades, this section of the map is a harrowing maze with poor visibility. That actually adds to gameplay rather than looking like shit, and more than a few heavies that I couldn't reliably kill with my meager equipment. Thankfully, there's more than enough space for you to avoid most threats. However, with the auto tag ability and stronger weapons, this area can pretty much become a slaughter. Up next is Ivanovsky's base, which, as one would expect, has several ways it can be tackled. In my first playthrough, I approached it from the left side. I find it to be the safest point of entry because there's a ton of cover and not too many enemies. It also happens to be the fastest way to get to Ivanovsky himself. This lab is also where you can find the virus samples. If you're clumsy and take too much damage, they can actually break, so be careful. Alternatively, there's also a really handy vantage point that gives you an excellent view of 99% of the enemies, and even if this approach takes longer, it's incredibly satisfying to wipe it undetected. You'll also have the opportunity to snipe Ivanovsky as he walks by a window, which is a nice use of AI pathing. Heading to the computer to destroy the test results doesn't give me very much to talk about due to its simple design. As far as I can tell, there's only one way in and out of the building, and it's virtually a series of rounded corridors on the way to the top. There's an exit at the top that will spew you back at the entrance, which is really handy. Overall, Altai Mountains is a pretty great first level that wastes almost no time in pushing you straight into the deep end with a nice meaty map that showcases exactly what the game has to offer, rather than making you play through a whole simple dumbed down map that mostly exists to help the newest of new players. The next mission sends you to Kolchak Harbor, where you need to take out an oil company CEO named Igor Sekov and ruin Siberia's plans to sabotage oil rigs belonging to other countries. Right off the bat, the invisible hand nudges you toward a lighthouse overlooking a large shipping dock that has your first objective, eliminating Sekov's strategist, Leonid Nishlev. Obviously, this is the only spot in the area that provides a wide overview of the whole place, and here it would be wise to discreetly pick off as many enemies as possible to make infiltration easier. The hand shows up again by placing a zip line right next to your vantage point, which is far safer than barging through the front gate, which is guarded by turrets, and more convenient than trying to step around the mines to enter the right side. But to be fair, that would bring you closer to Nishlev. Regardless of which entrance you take though, there's, as always, a lot of room to maneuver. Going back to Nishlev, he will always be contained within this small maze of crates, which results in this area actually having a really nice mix of sniping and CQC. For the sake of efficiency, the next objective you'll want to tackle is securing data from an electronic logbook nestled in this little base here. Despite its size, you've got a number of angles to approach it. The invisible hand is still at play, but at least is not quite as shoved in your face like the lighthouse from earlier, which makes the strategy I figured out feel much more satisfying. I found that the optimal route for this area requires you to first approach it from the left, disable the jammer, interrogate the sniper to quickly tag every enemy, and then run around to safely reach a vantage point overlooking everything. I believe it's a better idea to just rely on sniping here. You've got a line of sight on almost every enemy, and it's too dense to make CQC that practical. After you hack your objective, see, you know they're the bad guys because they use Alienware, you've also got a nearby CCTV terminal that links directly to the cameras in Sekov's area, just like that small outpost in Altai Mountains. Finally, there's a nearby door leading to the next area, and no, you can't cheese this objective by entering this door from the other side since it'll be locked. The bridge is somewhat involved for a traversal section and can offer wildly different experiences depending on how you choose to progress through the map. While this isn't a bad thing, there's issues with the pros and cons, in that one route is basically all pros and the other is almost all cons. The bad route is approaching it straight on. While this route may be more visible and obvious to a new player, it will be more work for less gain. While the patrol coming down the road may look scary, as long as you drop down underneath the bridge before they get to your side, it really isn't that hard, with the biggest threat being the damaging cold water. Be wary. However, in the worst case scenario, which will likely happen the first time you ever play it, according to my experiences, one of the bounties will spawn there, cramming more enemies into what's essentially a corridor, making it even less practical, but it is still doable once you map out a plan. Even in ideal conditions, you'll still miss the logbook if you haven't already done it, in which case you more than likely would have used the back door. Overall, it's just significantly less convenient with no real upsides for players who want an optimized run. As for the exit connected to the logbook, you're at a safe distance from the bridge so you can recon and snipe with much greater ease. Or, and I only recently discovered this, basically walk around the whole damn thing and proceed to the next area. At least it's not that obvious of an option. It's not bad, but it's certainly not ideal for a game built around choosing your own path. The invisible hand, have you noticed this level's pattern yet? Suggests you climb all the way up the building at the end of the bridge, rather than proceeding on ground level. Like the lighthouse, it'll offer you a vantage point that's far too useful to bypass. There's at least a few enemies patrolling inside that'll require some finesse to kill quickly and quietly, along with another CCTV terminal if you missed the one from earlier. Also, it's important to note that 2 more guards might spawn in the building as soon as you try to get to the roof, so you'll want to take them out ASAP. Not gonna lie, kind of a cheap move. Once you make it on top, you'll have a clear view of Segov's turf, and what follows is truly quite challenging to clear stealthily. Frankly, in this run, I only bothered to stay under the radar for like 99% of it, but that's not to say I didn't enjoy playing it. Like the last objective, sniping is by far the most practical way to deal with this, and good timing, aim, knowledge of enemy patrols, and use of the environment are paramount to stay discreet for as long as possible due to the amount of mooks and how easy it is to kill someone in a spot where their corpse will be spotted. Again, I at least managed to clear most of the area without raising an alarm. I only really said fuck it with Sekov and the 2 guards standing nearby. I didn't have luring rounds at the time, so I couldn't kill them without one of them seeing. Staying quiet is pretty important, since it's not as easy as shooting Sekov and booking it. You also need to steal a cell phone off his wife, Olga Kurchatova, and plant C4 on the massive ship nearby, so being the stealthiest sniper you can be is very much encouraged. Couple of things I want to share about Olga herself. There's a scripted event where she and 2 bodyguards make their way to a nearby helipad as a chopper arrives and lands. Firstly, contrary to what I had believed for the longest time, Olga will never actually get on the helicopter and leave, so you don't really need to rush to take her out, which is good because trying to kill her quietly while she's on the move with her 2 bodyguards is really hard. And secondly, you can in fact knock the chopper, including the 2 guards inside, right out of the sky with an EMP, and instead of exploding, it'll just bounce like a ball and glitch out for a bit. Oh, CI, never change. That makes Olga and her guards really easy pickings as they just dawdle about on the helipad. Anyway, after you're done with all those objectives, planting the C4 in the ship is really uneventful. The interior is as simple as can be, and it's usually empty. Nothing more. To conclude, Kolchak Harbor doesn't leave me as salty as the sea, and still scratches my stealthy sniping itch, but it definitely loses favor in my eyes for having a few too many instances of the best option being revealed to you too soon, and some of the lesser options not really offering any clear advantages to be worth considering. It isn't on-rails SGW2 trash, but it's not... Beketov Valley. Forests? In my Siberia? It's more likely than you think. Here, Seeker is tasked with cutting down Sasha Petroshenko as well as his rival Agvan Dorjev, crime bosses who have ties with the Siberian government. I'm just gonna say it right now. This is probably my favorite level in the whole game. However, it doesn't exactly have the most amazing start. You're in a pretty large, grassy field with a crap ton of mooks that you can't really kill without someone seeing. Really, the only strategy I use besides killing people recklessly is sneaking off to the side, interrogating the sniper hidden there, which is admittedly a really nice placement for observant players, shooting the other snipers, and then crawling my way through the grassy minefield to bypass everyone. There's not much room to reliably try other tactics or paths to my knowledge, but at the very least I don't feel like I was just handed the aforementioned strategy. Once you're out of there, it's best to head to this outpost where you need to free a prisoner. It's a heavily fortified area littered with a ton of guards, turrets, and spotlights, but it's surrounded by several vantage points in front and on either side, and entrances around the back, with all of these options being equally viable, give or take. The invisible hand is pretty weak here. It's also really nice that you have a line of sight on the jammer no matter what position you take. The interior can easily be navigated by hiding behind and weaving through some small buildings around the perimeter. Once you free the prisoner, he'll reveal the location of the hidden camera you need to grab from Petroshenko's villa. This isn't really the hand at play here. You'll likely only need this info on a first blind playthrough since the location never changes, and that's if you didn't pay attention to the briefing cutscene. Oh, and in addition, if you raise an alarm, a timer will count down and you have a limited amount of time to stop him from being executed. Should you fail, the mission surprisingly just carries on like normal rather than making you reload your save, but it will not trigger the exfiltration points. but frankly, I don't see why you wouldn't want to just complete the objective properly. After that, your options open up a fair bit. When it comes to whether or not you want to take out Petroshenko or Dorozhev first, it's not really about what's the closest objective, since depending on what you decide, you'll change the level scripting. If you choose to deal with Petroshenko first, Dorozhev will arrive at the villa shortly after, unless you set off an alarm prematurely, which either creates an opening for a double kill if you use an old church across the lake as a sniping position, or an opportunity to use mines to blow up his, vehicle if you approach on foot. The Invisible Hand's influence could be considered to be quite strong here. The church vantage point isn't too far from the prison area, the villa is arguably best dealt with from there, and quite literally killing two birds with one stone is very tempting. But thankfully, the other tactics you could try feel equally viable. While it's clearly designed around being a shooting gallery, Petroshenko's villa plays perfectly fine on foot. There's snipers you can easily interrogate for recon, stealthy entry points, nice camera terminal placements, a ton of room to maneuver and take cover, and generally, it's just a cool place to infiltrate. Also, apparently old Sasha is a gamer too. And don't forget the camera hidden behind the poorly optimized glass in the sauna. The villa also has a feature where if you raise an alarm, a bunch of shutters will close to protect Petroshenko, although this is obviously more relevant when you snipe. As for Dorozhev, his compound is a great section, regardless of when you decide to do it. From the front of the compound alone, you've got a handful of entrances to choose from, with perhaps the best one being hidden through a sewer pipe to the far right. The one on the left is also perfectly viable as well, as long as you time your kills right. Once you're in the thick of it, you've got a series of buildings and scaffolding that you can navigate to quietly make your way to where the intel is, as well as Dorozhev himself if you haven't gone to the villa yet. As for the key you need to access the intel, obviously he will have it, which is a minor incentive to go for him first. However, if you trigger his meeting with Petroshenko and for whatever reason forget to loot his corpse, an officer in the area will also have one, which is good foresight. With the individual hotspots generally having a nice degree of openness and number of approaches that don't completely overshadow each other, the way you can manipulate the events of the mission, spawning both bounties on repeat playthroughs and being the most interesting looking map of the bunch, Beketov Valley is a fantastic, extremely replayable experience, and it's pretty much contracts at its peak. From perhaps the warmest location to the coldest, you're sent to the Arakcheyev Fortress to take out both Dr. Antonasia Alikhanova and Dr. Nikita Zaitsev and stop all their plans to... I'm gonna let Handler tell you.
And how will these doctors' deaths help the client?
Am I to remind you we're talking eugenics here?
Pretty bad. The twist with this level is that your main target uses a body double that will alert the whole area if killed. It's a great idea on paper, but I'll talk about it more over time. After dealing with a squad of enemies in an area that's even more of a restrictive introduction than the last map, we very quickly arrive at the first objective of finding evidence of genetic experimentation located in this space with heavy enemy presence, along with cameras, turrets, and mines. In terms of vantage points, you've got one near your spawn that provides engagements that are up to 450 meters away, or one directly across that's about 200 meters away, which is accessible after passing through a small gauntlet of enemies. Since the base is so dense, I found it significantly more effective to just kill a handful of key enemies and sneak through a fantastic semi-hidden entrance around the side that I only recently discovered that allows you to avoid the cluster of mooks and turrets around the front to easily slip into the main building. There's even a CCTV terminal along your path. Nice flow. And side note, there is a laptop in the base that will deactivate all the turrets when hacked, which is really nice. The only problem is that it's in a really bad exposed spot and isn't worth the effort. After you grab the evidence, there's a discreet exit on the other side that will lead you straight to your next objective. That's really nice to have, but the Invisible Hand has reared its head again, for reasons I'll get into. In this outpost, you need to assassinate Zaitsev and steal his pen drive for intel. It's a decently sized arena-like area that gives you a nice amount of room to get different angles on the building. I think the most efficient and stealthy route you can take is running all the way across the area, hopping a fence, and sneaking through a vent to quietly get inside and kill Zaitsev. The other side is a bit too busy and exposed for my liking. It is made quite a bit more cumbersome by a sniper in a tower that can be easily seen if killed.
Reporting casualty.
After you get the pen drive, you're told that the real Arakcheyev either is or isn't a smoker, which will actually randomly switch between playthroughs. Now, normally this would be a really cool bit of information. However, because the invisible hand practically forces you to do this objective before the main target because it's in your path, and going all the way to that place only to loop back is just inefficient, it feels like the potential is already choked out. If the devs took more advantage of the open-ended design and placed this intel in an area within or even beyond Arakcheyev's area, they could have set up a good challenge that rewards players that go out of their way to make their runs as stealthy and as optimized as possible. Alternatively, more clues spread out over the map could have been an interesting idea too. The next objective of finding proof of any casualties from Arakcheyev's project, you know, as if the word eugenics wasn't enough to set off every possible red flag, is extremely close by in this sparse, icy field with 2 towers and an outpost up ahead. There's not too much to get into since this area borders on a traversal section with some cameras. The towers are obviously vantage points to snipe from. I personally wouldn't and didn't bother staying undetected for the whole time here, since the outpost is so dense that it's hard for bodies to not be eventually seen. After Seeker finally gets why eugenics are bad, we arrive at Arakcheyev's compound. A pretty safe way to start tackling this area is by going around to the side and interrogating a sniper to speed up recon. And if you look to the left, you'll see Arakcheyev and a prime example of how not to utilize a body double. The bitches spawn right next to each other, next to a helicopter that might as well be a bomb. The invisible hand has turned into Ubi and is screaming at you to do it no balls.
Oh my god, JC, a bomb!
We don't know if that was the real doctor. Congratulations.
Obviously, you'll only take this opportunity if you really don't care about being subtle, but the fact that you don't even need to trigger an event or even just wait for this opening to happen nevertheless sends the wrong message of how we ought to approach this situation. They do eventually split up, but I feel like it should have been like that from the start. Anyway, considering how wide open the area ahead is, I personally decided just to kill a few mooks in my way the first time around, snuck into the base by climbing up the side, and carefully observed both Arakcheyevs until I saw one of them whip out a cigarette. In this case, I was looking for the non-smoker, who was thankfully closer to me and out of sight from all the other mooks. In my second run, I tried a tactic I never thought would work by entering the base through the bottom and climbing my way up. You'll need to evade some turrets, but you'll be rewarded with a CCTV terminal in the shaft that's safe to access. On top is the helipad, and it's surprisingly not as bad as I expected. Once you let the whole squad separate, there's only one heavy who normally has his back turned, so you can easily run over to the other side. Conveniently, the doctor I needed to kill happened to be there too. After you eliminate her, all that's left to do is to destroy the rest of the results within the insides of the fortress. The most visible entry is obviously the front door, and you'll need to carefully take out the guards inside. But if you poke around a bit more, there's a set of scaffolding to the left that leads to a vent, which in turn leads to the top floor where your objective is, evading all the enemies. You can also leave through it as well. While Arakcheyev Fortress is certainly a fine level, I find myself pining for what could have been. Having body doubles that require exploring the map for clues to figure out the real target is a tried and true trope, and I really wish it was fully committed to the idea. Besides that, I really do enjoy the repeated use of less obvious routes that lead to huge advantages, so at least it's still doing something with the sandbox design. Speaking of disappointment, how about the final contract in the Sibirskaya-7 Junction? Here, you're tasked with assassinating the Siberian Prime Minister himself, Nergui Kurchatov, along with his strategist Zenik Alikhanov, and sabotaging their defense missiles. Unlike the previous Woodland map, this is easily my least favorite level. It of course has its moments, but it's hard for me to get excited about it since there's a number of things that kind of annoy me. I mean, first impressions just from appearances alone aren't too hot. Does this midday mountain range with the atmosphere of a lazy afternoon hike scream final boss to you? Altai Mountains felt more like a final level than this. And as for the layout, Sibirskaya is basically a ring, so progression feels a lot more linear than previous missions. That being said, Handler emphasizes at the start that
there are 2 routes, Seeker. Your choice.
which means you can either make your way through an army of enemies patrolling a field ahead to kill Alikhanov first, or you can sneak your way off to the side and walk along a ruined train to get to a dam that has some intel you need to steal. For the sake of organization, I'll go over the objectives in this order, since I believe this is the most obvious route one would take and has always been my default, but I'll mention any differences that appear if you go the opposite way if there are any. So, assuming we want to get to Alikhanov first, we'll need to navigate our way through this gauntlet of a train yard. Simply put, this area has always been quite a struggle for me, and it took me a while to figure out a good way to do it. It's not just that the layout lacks cover and has a ton of enemies, but it's this chucklefuck of a sniper that throws a wrench into your plans. Obviously, he overlooks the whole area, making killing and sneaking a bit more difficult. But the most baffling thing is that, due to his position, his corpse, if you choose to kill him, has a chance of being seen by enemies. So in a way, it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Luckily, in one run, after clearing out the left side of the field, which isn't nearly as dense as the right side, I managed to sneak past the sniper without killing him until I did. After that, you'll very quickly arrive at the base where Alikhanov is. From here, getting rid of him isn't too hard despite the tight security. While it took the time to do things like disabling the nearby jammer, taking out a handful of patrolling mooks, and hacking the cameras, I reckon that all you really need to do is sit in the sniper tower and wait for his head to ever so slightly pop out of cover. Unlike other targets, there's no additional objective nestled in here, so you don't really need to worry about sticking around. Considering the scale of the area, this is rather wasted potential. Also, this is where I ran into the jammer bug. This map hates me. As for the alternate route, which is connected to Kurchatov's area, it isn't quite as practical. The first thing you'll run into is quite possibly the densest area in the whole game, with an entire platoon spread out across this tiny tunnel. While at a glance it might be rather intimidating and difficult to tell how you can navigate the area undetected like the first time I discovered this place, all you really need to do is kill the two guards on the right side, awkwardly jump up the wreckage, and you're home free. Trying anything else will likely just get you caught. The moment you leave the tunnel, you're immediately gonna be pinned down by 3 guards and a turret. While you can crawl underneath the platform to sneak past the guards, since killing them undetected is quite risky, the snipers just ahead will spot you really easily and you're much further away from the jammer. And even if you're successful, you're likely gonna want to run up to the exact same places to disable the jammer and shoot Alikhanov that are less of a hassle to get to if you had just approached it from the other side. I suppose it's technically doable under the radar, but it didn't feel right to me. Also, I suppose you could use that tunnel to go for Kurchatov right after killing Alikhanov, but that comes with its own efficiency issues, so I strongly recommend against it. If you chose to take this path, that likely means you haven't yet done the objective at the dam, which I assume strangely makes Kurchatov's pathing less advantageous according to my tests. I'll elaborate later, but it's yet again the invisible hand pulling the strings. And secondly, what would normally be the safest exit as you transition from one objective area to here is now unusable as an entrance. It's one way. And because you can't climb through the windows, the only way to get through is through the main doorway, so you'll have to deal with a bunch of enemies. Going back to the main route, not too far from the sniper tower is a pathway that leads directly to an outpost overlooking a dam a few hundred meters away. Now, this is a hell of a vantage point. From here, it's super easy to recon the place and thin the horde before you move up with the zipline. Very satisfying. Now, if you took the alternate path through an incredibly linear and possibly busted ditch...
Victor 3 to base. We have enemy contact. Over.
This is exactly where you'd end up as well, but without the head start and peace of mind from sniping. Thankfully, this area of the dam isn't as heavily guarded, and it's where your objective is, so even if you go this way, this part isn't too bad. Upon grabbing the intel, Seeker learns that Kurchatov's windows are bulletproof. We'll get to that. The dam leads directly to a power plant where you need to plant some C4 on a transport train. Overall, I feel like this area does take a fair amount of finesse to do undetected considering the almost linear layout, multiple floors, and exposed enemy positions, but I somehow managed to pull it off on my second attempt. Not much else to talk about here, it borders on a traversal section. Finally, now for the Prime Minister himself. The correct way. Again, did this bland building scream big bad to you? Not gonna lie, I don't think there's a worse worse example of the invisible hand than this. I could talk all about how the right side of the building is a good entry point and how you can eventually climb on the roof of Kurchatov's office to do a death from above, which is kinda cool. By the way, jump on the mook next to him, not on him directly. You'll just land on the desk and get shot. But the thing is, despite hiding behind bulletproof glass, it doesn't take long for him to step outside of his safe zone and chat on the phone like a sitting duck. Like Alikonov, there's no other objective to get in the area, so you can just pop him and book it. Except it feels worse because the hand is spanking you at this point, and it's incredibly anticlimactic for someone who's supposed to be the big bad of the game. All of the other main targets and even some side targets and bounties incentivize slow and stealthy sniping by forcing you to infiltrate the areas afterward, so why make this any different? Look, I'm all for avoiding dominant strategies to get the absolute most out of a game, but the fact that Kurchatov stepping outside is triggered by you posting up in the vantage point directly across from him gives me the impression that this part of the map was kinda phoned in, and that the game just wants you to hurry up and finish it already. Going back to that alternate tunnel path, sure, I could just go through there to make sure he doesn't come out, but then that makes heading to the next objective a pain in the butt, making it feel more like a punishment for trying something different. And yes, I know that I shouldn't be mad that I was able to snipe my target in a sniping game, but this doesn't feel earned at all. There was barely any kind of short time window I had to wait for, no reason to infiltrate afterwards, no careful observation needed. Even if there was some kind of distraction I could trigger by interacting with the environment, or even if I just had to use something like a luring round, just feeling like I had some input would have made things better. Anyway, I think you get the idea. Do I hate Sibirskaya-7? Not really, but suffering from the most restrictive level design, missed opportunities worse than Arakcheyev, and generally just not looking or feeling like the climax it ought to be, all being held together by the invisible hand's iron grip, this is by far the weakest map of the bunch and isn't one that I really bother replaying that much. It is still better than SGW 1 and 2 though. Congratulations, Seeker, you did it to Siberia. Unfortunately, unlike the last 3 games in the series, Contracts has very little in the way of DLC. Alongside the 2 previously mentioned DLC weapons that don't have any special properties beyond giving you a minor head start, you've also got a camo, Steam Mist, or Galaxy Glow for GOG copies. It looks nice, but I didn't bother buying it. And aside from the wasteful multiplayer and free camo packs and shotgun, the only post-launch content pack for a long time was Fun with Flags. Fun with Flags! But as I was working on this video, over 2 years after it came out and 6 months after its sequel, Contracts got 4 new weapon DLCs, one of them being former console exclusives and the rest being guns ported from Contracts 2 oddly, even the crossbow and suppressible assault rifle. Even stranger is that one of the base game guns, the Blower R93, who named this, actually had its textures, scope model, and even sounds replaced with their future selves. Honestly, I'm neither gonna buy nor cover them here. I doubt the former will have anything new for me to talk about besides their embarrassingly terrible animations. As for the latter, I already bought most of their equivalents in C2, and frankly, they were already sort of a waste of money. So, stay tuned. Despite some ever-present quirks and jank, Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts is a culmination of pretty much all the lessons CI learned over the years, condensed into one fulfilling stealth sniping game, and I will stand on that hill and let Seeker just fucking kill me. Yes, it still needs more polish, its bugs do genuinely annoy me, and there's some mistakes and missed opportunities with the level design in spots. But at the end of the day, all I really remember is the satisfying sniping, the solid open-ended level design, the rewarding feeling of completing contracts undetected, the smooth player progression, and the countless nights I've spent replaying, relaxing, and shooting shit while shooting the shit with friends, even after looking at it under a critical eye. Like its predecessor, the core gameplay is solid and enjoyable, but this time it isn't weighed down by severe pacing issues. I love it. Fuck you, fight me. It's probably the first CI game that I can actually recommend with very few reservations. If you like stealth games and don't mind a little jank, give it a shot. But if what I said still sounds like blind shilling for a flawed product, I wasn't sponsored to make this video, so would I really lie to you?